Resident Evil 1 Remake. Yeah, the one that came out in 2002 for the GameCube is one of the greatest survival horror games ever made, and many still claim it as being Resident Evil's very best. Over the past few weeks, we've seen some new rumors hit the internet suggesting a possible remake of the iconic first Resident Evil, with some, on the other hand, disputing those claims. Here, we are going over absolutely everything we know about a potential second remake of the very first Resident Evil game, and why, if such rumors turn out to be true, a return to the Spencer Mansion would be the perfect way to cap off Resident Evil's 30th anniversary. With the past several Resident Evil games shattering sales milestones, Capcom, due to the success of Resident Evil and their other franchises, has emerged as one of the most successful game companies in the modern era. With such success, it's no surprise that Resident Evil, currently their most lucrative franchise, continues to see big investments, with the upcoming Resident Evil 9 launching sometime soon, along with numerous reports suggesting the developer is currently working on up to 5 titles within the Resident Evil series. With just over a year away from Capcom celebrating Resident Evil's 30th anniversary, and their continued efforts to remaking more games in the 3-decade-old franchise, we are likely to find out firsthand what the next Resident Evil game will be within the coming year. Recent signs are suggesting it could be a return to where it all started, a remake of the very first Resident Evil game. Now, Resident Evil has already been remade, making this potential remake the second remake of the first game, and well, the DNA of the very first remake seems to be the foundation here in this potential project. The rumors for such a project come from an anonymous email received by content creator Biohazard Declassified, where in his YouTube video, he outlines the insider's knowledge of the title. And it is here that we see that this supposed remake is very much a merging of elements from the existing Resident Evil 1 remake and that of the Resident Evil 2 remake. Just want to throw this out there. Take all this with grains of salt, as none of this has been confirmed by Capcom. These are all just rumors and should be treated as such, so don't take any of this as factual just yet. Alright, so this is what we are working with for the upcoming Resident Evil 1 remake rumor. The working title is said to be Biohazard Resident Evil 1. Similar to how the naming convention for Biohazard Resident Evil 7 reflected a departure from the previous action-oriented Resident Evils and returned to its horror roots, putting Biohazard in the title alongside RE1 reflects a return to its roots, the return to where it all started. In this remake, the insider claimed that the Resident Evil 1 lore would be further explored, perhaps going beyond the introduction of Lisa Trevor here and introducing some more lore of the Arklay Mountains and surrounding areas of the Spencer Mansion will be explored here. As Lisa Trevor was introduced in the existing 2002 RE1 Remake, Crimson Heads were mentioned in the insider email, a key component to the remake that made the revisiting of previously traversed areas much more harrowing, as these souped-up zombies were much more challenging to take down. With the return of the Crimson Heads, perhaps the lighter mechanic may also return here. This supposed remake suggests that the game's pace will be slower than the Resident Evil 2 remake, in addition to the enemies requiring more bullets to take down, as the email was said to have used the term bullet sponges referring to the zombies. Speaking of zombies, each one will have their own unique model due to the smaller number of enemies within the game. With the rumored remake, the game would divert from the original pre-rendered backgrounds and instead adopt the series' standard over-the-shoulder third-person perspective, with the email suggesting that each area would load up background assets and other visual enhancements when doors are opened. That's basically it as far as the rumored features are concerned from Biohazard Declassified's video, so if you'd like to see more of this information explained in greater detail, you can view his video linked in the description. While that may sound good and all, just know that prominent Resident Evil insider Dusk Golem has refuted all the mentioned info about the supposed Resident Evil 1 remake on Twitter. Again, when dealing with insiders, take all this with grains of salt, but considering that Dusk Golem has been quite accurate with leaking key details of recent Resident Evil projects, just keep your expectations in check. Considering Dusk earlier this year reported that Capcom is working on up to 5 Resident Evil projects, with one of them being Resident Evil 9 and with some of them being remakes, I wouldn't be surprised if a game like Resident Evil 1 Remake will be released at some point, considering this is the only mainline Resident Evil game from the original PS1 trilogy that hasn't seen an over-the-shoulder remake facelift. While the 2002 GameCube remake is still an incredible game to this day, there are a considerable amount of Resident Evil players who would like to see this masterpiece receive a modern glow-up, and if the details from Biohazard Declassified's video have any indication on what this hypothetical remake may be, it looks like the core DNA from the 2002 remake classic will very much be present. As we know, the game has been incredibly well received, won numerous awards, and the consensus was that this was the best Resident Evil game that had ever debuted at the time of its release. But its release was over 20 years ago. For as great of a game as it still is today, it still doesn't dismiss the fact that this game is over 20 years old and is a prime candidate to get yet another remake. While I personally don't take issue with the fixed camera angles and combat systems of this classic remake, this isn't about how I feel about it, but rather how the community feels about it going forward. While Resident Evil Code Veronica is the clear winner when it comes to what fans want in the next Resident Evil remake, we can't dismiss that there is also a sizable base of both older Resident Evil fans and newer ones alike that would be more than happy to revisit the Spencer Mansion where we first got introduced to these now iconic characters and storylines. Just remember, the vast majority of players started flocking to Resident Evil after the success of Resident Evil 4, and with every game since Resident Evil 4 debuted in 2005, these Resident Evil games, both mainline and remakes alike, have been pushing north of 10 million units sold and still climbing. Another remake of Resident Evil 1 would give both older fans, and especially new fans of the series, an incentive to experience the first game, seeing as a number of Resident Evil fans are uninterested and unwilling to play a game that sports fixed camera angles, old school combat mechanics, and some admittedly dated voice acting. Again, I freaking love Resident Evil 1 Remake, and I personally think that the RE1 Remake is, on paper, the best remake we've seen Capcom make of the Resident Evil franchise, and this comes from a fan who especially loves the more contemporary Resident Evil 2 and Resident Evil 4 remakes. I've been making Resident Evil content for over a year now, and I am overwhelmingly being told in the comments that both newer and older fans of Resident Evil alike would love to experience Resident Evil Remake in the RE engine with an over-the-shoulder perspective, and I mean, I can't blame them for wanting that. With the 30th anniversary rapidly approaching, a ground-up remake of the Resident Evil 1 remake just makes perfect sense. Add an excellent VR mode like the previous few Resident Evil games have sported, and you have an instant winner. We've discussed this at length in another video surrounding the next remakes that are likely to happen in the series, and we have to discuss story continuity when it comes to what happens after Resident Evil 4 Remake. The last 3 games to get remade, Resident Evils 2, 3, and 4, suggest that 5 is next in line when following that chronology, but I argue that while Resident Evil 5 definitely makes sense to get remade, games like Resident Evil 1, 0, and Code Veronica clearly make more sense for many reasons. One such reason is the obvious. Resident Evil 5 still plays rather fine in today's standard, and most will argue that it at least looks and plays much better than the older Resident Evil games that haven't been recently remade yet. Secondly, and perhaps more importantly, hugely important characters like Chris Redfield and Albert Wesker have not yet been properly established in the contemporary Resident Evil remakes, resulting in an RE5 remake that introduces plenty of characters and concepts that haven't been properly touched up on and established. Remaking these older games will fix that. Sure, it mixes up the order of the remakes, but at the end of the day, we're all smart enough to know which number comes before the other, and it's just more Resident Evil remakes for us to sink our teeth into, and if done well by Capcom, us fans will be pleased. The developers of Resident Evil 1 Remake claim that the remake was a product of the original vision the team had for the very first Resident Evil game, and that extra few years the remake had over the original to take advantage of the available technology resulted in a game that was decidedly definitive, but very much a product of its own time. The recent Resident Evil remakes all fit a very deliberate format. Third-person, over-the-shoulder gameplay, a refined system first introduced from the original Resident Evil 4, and we've seen how the gameplay has fared. Resident Evil 2 was given new life with its remake, and its mechanics and different perspective made the game feel that much more atmospheric, haunting, and visceral. And while Resident Evil 3 Remake was admittedly rushed out and failed to truly capitalize on what made the original Resident Evil 3 so great, the gunplay and perspective shifts aren't what was to blame for that blunder. Resident Evil 4 Remake, while a game that wasn't exactly necessary, is undoubtedly the most polished of the bunch. Resident Evil 1 is the only game from the original trilogy that hasn't seen any modern facelift, and while players can easily pick up the HD remaster of the remake on their preferred devices, it still feels like a piece is missing from the collection of remakes we currently have, and this is coming from a huge fan of Resident Evil 1 and its current remake. Switching the perspective over to an over-the-shoulder format with the current gunplay of Resident Evil will, in my opinion, do wonders for the game and open the floodgates to fans who have been wanting to visit or revisit the Spencer Mansion. The original Resident Evil 2 featured incredibly narrow pathways and corridors, just like the areas of RE1 did. But look at how well that conversion fared for Resident Evil 2 Remake from a gameplay perspective. The blueprint is right in front of Capcom. Simply remake the entirety of Resident Evil 1 Remake with all of its enhancements over the original game and present it in the RE engine with the modern gameplay and mechanics of the recent RE games. Put in VR for icing on the cake, and perhaps make the game feature the canonical ending for the first time as the cherry on top. There's no shortage of Resident Evil 1 releases, with the original, the Director's Cut Edition, the DS version, mobile versions, the 2002 remake, and the HD remaster of said remake being readily available on most current hardware. But it's been a long while since the original survival horror game got a new update. This rumor may turn out to be true, bringing back the original with an update in line with what we got with the Resident Evil 2 remake, containing features from the existing remake while simultaneously expanding the game's lore. At the same time, this rumor is just a rumor, and with insiders already refuting the validity of this game, it's best to look at all this as just that, a rumor. Even so, the possibility of seeing Resident Evil 1 getting remade is a very high one at that, as a modern day revisit to the Spencer Mansion is among the most requested, even though a Code Veronica remake seems to be the clear fan favorite for now to see get a remake. If you thought that was a lot regarding an RE1 remake, consider watching this video for all the latest updates surrounding Resident Evil 9, and be sure to stay tuned to the channel for more Resident Evil content going forward. Thank you all for your awesome support, and I'll see all you real soon in the next one.